Welcome. Hello, everyone. I'm Scott Smallwood, one of the co-founders of Open Campus, a nonprofit news organization focused on higher education. And I'd like to thank ASU GSV for organizing this panel for us today. It's titled The Critical Importance of Student Voice and Free Speech in 2020. And we've got a great group of experts with us that come at this from a variety of perspectives. We're joined by Carolyn DeWitt. She's the president of Rock the Vote. And by Mike Huseby. He's the CEO of Barnes & Noble Education. And Rodney Stark Jr. He's a recent graduate from Orange Coast College in California. I'd like to say here in California, but I'm not in California. And Neha Dalal, a student at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. So I talked with some people here on this panel way back in January or February, what seemed like a whole different world that we then lived in. And it seemed like 2020 mattered, obviously, because it was an election year. And we didn't know then that it would become one of the most consequential years in a long, long time. And so the context for this whole conversation feels different, but also even more important. Rodney, I was hoping to start with you. You graduated, I think in the spring from Orange Coast College in California. Could you just start off by telling us some about what you've been doing since then and how that's shaping maybe some of your views on how this generation, your generation, is making its voice heard?
Yeah, absolutely. At the tail end of the semester, as we all kind of know, I feel like my year this year kind of started with watching the Ahmaud Arbery video, and that kind of sparked something in me to go out and just kind of show my support around his birthday, because the video came out 2 months late. And a few days after that, the George Floyd video came out, and I was kind of at a crossroads where I was finished with school and I had time, I had a bit of resources, so I decided to go out there and join the movement. And that kind of snowballed into me going from Minneapolis with community organizations on the ground, to Oakland, California, to LA, to Louisville, and then to DC most recently for the March on Washington. And just in my travels, it's really put things in perspective for me as far as the level of, I think, integrity that my generation has as far as things that they're kind of willing to put up with and things that they're not willing to put up with. And for a while before I went out, I kind of felt like I was, I guess, one of few that kind of felt that way until I was actually on the ground. So I saw my generation in a completely different light, going from city to city, and then to see that it wasn't just in one city, it wasn't just in one state, it wasn't even just in one country. Started seeing videos from Europe where, you know, my generation went out into the streets and organized, and you start getting videos from Syria and Palestine. So it really was a perspective changer for me to see the entire world, honestly, on one accord, generationally, kind of with one message and one voice. And I think that was powerful. I think that was very powerful.
That's great. Neha, you're currently completing an MBA at Stanford, and one of the leaders there of a student-led venture investment fund. I'm wondering what shifts have you noticed in your classmates or friends, or that are thinking about both their work, their future work, their work in business school, but also their civic involvement, also sort of how, whether that's investing or the work they're going to do, what are they thinking about?
It's a good question, Scott, and I'm excited also to be on this panel and chatting with all of you. So I was coming from a background in policy and working in DC and chairing the U.S. Youth Working Group to the United Nations. So when I came to business school, everybody was cautioning me, hey, you're stepping into a different space here. People aren't going to care as much about social impact. And I have never been so happy to have all these folks been proved wrong, because my classmates at Stanford really do actually care a lot about social impact. So as you mentioned, I lead our student-led impact fund, the GSB Impact Fund. It had about 150 people in my year wanted to get involved in it, which is well over a third of our class. So these are people who want to spend their time at business school, not just thinking about business issues, but thinking about the impact that business has on society. And this is part of a broader trend. Millennials, more than any other generation, care about the social impact of the companies that they are spending money with, that they are working for, and they're holding these companies to a higher standard than ever has been in the past. And I think this is a really, really wonderful development, and one that I personally am super excited to see.
That's awesome. Carolyn, just turning to you real quick and thinking about the last 6, I don't know, are we on to month 7 now, of how's the pandemic creating challenges for your work at Rock the Vote and its efforts more broadly? How is it affecting the work?
Yeah, so I would say it's a few different phases have happened this year since shelter in place really started in March. We first obviously saw for all generations kind of the derailment of momentum around the election, right? Like no one was focused on the election. People are focused on their jobs, on their health, on childcare. For young people who are graduating like Rodney, right? They're complete, like young people are already in a transitional moment just naturally. And so there were so many more questions for them of entering the workforce, whether or not they're going back to school, what does that look like? And it was really around June, following the protests in response to the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, where we saw actually a huge spike in voter registrations among young people in particular. We tend to see that voters are very deadline driven, so we see those surges right before deadlines, but there were no major deadlines in early June. It was really the fact that young people are saying, enough is enough. We are tired of this. We need change in our communities. We need change in our country. And what we're actually seeing is kind of a parallel to what we saw in 2018 with March for Our Lives. This is around racial injustice, but that the youth generation is very active. They care very much about civic engagement. The challenge is that we see generation after generation, youth are told that they're the problem generation, that they're the ones who are apathetic and lazy. But if we look at history, this is a generation without representation. We do nothing to prepare 18-year-olds to participate in our democracy when they turn 18. So this is a societal problem that we really need to change. At Rock the Vote, we're very I guess, well-positioned. There's a lot more responsibility on us because we've been able to adapt. We've been using civic technology for 20 years. We use a lot of digital organizing because that's where young people are. So if anything, we're now not just responsible for helping new voters navigate through this process, but actually all voters, because all voters are navigating through voting in a pandemic for the first time.
Yeah, fascinating. Mike, I'm thinking, building off what Carolyn just said about this generation and sort of the stereotypes about this generation or any generation of young people. You guys at Barnes & Noble Education with the Barnes & Noble College Insight have been doing a bunch of interesting survey research of college students in Gen Z. What since last spring and the work you've done over the summer, what jumps out at you? What do you say, like, oh, this is what they're telling us?
Yeah, Scott, we serve about 6 million students across the U.S. through our business. And we have a cohort of about, a couple different cohorts of about 10,000 students that we routinely survey and talk to in an effort to better understand how to serve them better. And we've been doing some surveys in student voice, attitudes on politics, mental health, a lot of things that shed a lot of insight. To answer your question directly, what's really jumping out is that as Carolyn said, and as I think both Rodney and Neha have said as well, there's a very, very strong desire to make a difference. This generation, Gen Z, is a very collaborative, digital native generation. And because of that, they're always looking for information. So part of the issue is, how do you get the best information? How can you trust the information that you get to make decisions? And who do you turn to? You turn to social media, you turn to your parents, your family, your friends, your communities. And at what level do you want to get involved? Because it's not just the national election that's important. So I think, Rodney and Neha, some of the things they're doing at the local level, whether it's in the organizations they're involved in, joining the protests, things that can have an impact, helps to lead to more satisfaction, less frustration, because we're all frankly frustrated, probably to a certain extent, with the national dialogue, the national press. And to the extent you can localize it and find something for you to do that gives you personal satisfaction and impact, that's probably the most healthy and the most productive thing to do.
Rodney.
And that's not necessarily easy, but that's what we try to encourage. We try to encourage it in our people. We have initiatives within our own company to try to drive that as well.
Rodney, does that resonate for you? The idea of like being in a either a local space or some space that feels more like where you have more agency?
Absolutely. That's right up my alley. And I'm such a self-determined type of person, that just the concept of voting alone or depending on someone who is thousands of miles away to dictate or to change the reality that's immediately around me, to me personally, just doesn't make sense. So I'm so much more about just getting out there and getting hands-on with my own communities. Even during the protests, after about 2 cities, I kind of was tired of just marching and chanting. So I compiled all the research that I had done, just on like police accountability, qualified immunity, things like that, and compiled like a 7-page document, basically on how to hold police departments accountable nationwide through the entities that insure them and the accreditation agencies that give them jurisdiction over a city or a county. And took that myself and just dispersed it on the ground, kind of told like organizers like, hey, I got this information. I don't know how serious they took it, but they have it. I could lead them to the lake, but I can't make them drink, but to me, kind of how Mike was saying, that gave me a sense of peace that, I personally did what I could. And from there on out, it's kind of out of my control. And I feel like that's a healthy way of kind of handling it, instead of wanting so badly for someone else to do or to affect, what's going on around you. Right. If you try your best, that's all you can do, at the end of the day.
So, Carolyn, how does what Rodney just said connect with how you guys think about the work? I saw you nodding at, thinking about civic engagement. You heard him say sort of, voting's not going to be enough, or voting seems small, or voting seems far away for a different thing. How do you guys talk about that, or how does that play into the work that you do?
Yeah, so it's an important discussion, because I think so many times it's the answer that we give people is go vote, right? Voting is one tool that we have in our toolbox. It is perhaps the most important. Like, we can't actually expect change if we're not willing to do that. So it's the most basic, fundamental thing we can do. And that's not just, I think a lot of education needs to be done around, that's not just at the top of the ticket of the presidency, but all the way down. And so much of that is helping voters, particularly young voters, but all voters, quite frankly, about what the roles of the positions are, about when their local elections are happening. I mean, there's been a huge amount of, since the Black Lives Matter protests really started in 2013, there's been a lot of education around the role of DAs and district attorneys and what prosecutors do, right? And so we've seen, when we educate young people who are affected by this role, in places like Chicago, after Laquan McDonald was shot, in Philadelphia, when we had the DA race there, young people actually increased their turnout by 279% in the DA race in Philly. So there is a big part of education of what are these positions that we're electing people for. Protest is an extremely important form of civic participation. Voting is also, right? But we can't just elect our leaders. Like, the way I think about it is we're the bosses in our democracy. We hire and we fire our elected leaders. And just like we wouldn't fire an employee without telling them they're doing an awful job and what we expect them to do, we need to be communicating. And sometimes that communication comes in an email, sometimes it's a letter, sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's protest, right? And so that's, I think, what we're seeing actually is amazing generate. They're very active citizens. They're very active communicators, and have expectations of the people they're putting in office.
Right. Rodney, real quick, back to you. I'm thinking, is that what Carolyn just said? Does that line up? Or when you're at these protests, is a thing like the election very much on the back burner and feel like a very different issue? Or does it feel like, as she said, one tool in a toolbox that we've got?
Yeah, just the general feeling, because we were kind of talking earlier about the turnout of young people voting, and I think that's kind of like the fundamental topic of this entire panel. And the turnout for young voters is just extremely low, and to me, from my perspective, it's visible on the ground that the election and voting itself just almost seems non-existent. To me, and I'm assuming to others that are out there, we have an issue that's present right now that needs to be addressed right now. And voting tends to be something that is like future tense, right? Like, somebody's going to get elected in November, and then once they, I guess, settle in, sort through the paperwork, get to the issue that we're out there burning buildings about, it's 6-8 months later. And I think that in terms of justice and, things like that, we're looking for, you can't expect immediate results, right? But I think that we're looking for something quick. And in terms of our voice being heard, a burning building gets the point across a lot faster than a vote does. Right. And I think that's just how people kind of rationalize it. Not saying that voting isn't important, because I tell my friends all the time, like, okay, you can say, oh, I'm not voting, or I don't believe in, any of the politics and stuff like that, but what are you doing? And I think a lot of people just kind of lean on that, just, I'm not voting, and, I have my positions on that, but they're not doing anything in their communities. They're not feeding the homeless. They're not trying or doing, anything to be hands-on to actually affect change that, they don't particularly agree with. So just like she said, it's one tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
And I think that all tools definitely need to be used. But for me right now, at this point in my life, and, my perspective is very limited, I just don't see the effects of voting within my community just yet. And that's probably just more I need to learn about it, honestly, and educate myself further.
Neha, what resonates of that, or that Rodney sort of talked, you heard a part of what he was saying there had a little feeling of apathy, maybe not his apathy, but apathy around him in other spots. How are your classmates or the people that are working with you at the fund? They're obviously not apathetic, right? What's your reaction to some of that feeling of like, well, we can't do anything?
I think it's a really good question, and I think it's a very hard question, right? So I agree with the analogy that voting is one tool in the toolkit, but if that's the only answer we're giving young people, it's very easy to feel apathetic. I think a lot of us involved in the fund, and a lot of folks involved in all the other previous organizations I've been part of, to Rodney's earlier point, having something that you can actually own and put all your time and energy to is a really empowering way to sometimes fight back against the injustice that you feel in the world, and a way to change helplessness to empowerment. And that's something that we've tried to create, not just through the fund, but through all the other projects that I've worked on in the past. That being said, as of now, young people vote at the lowest rate of any age demographic, right? It's only about half of the population at most between 18 and 29 are voting in a presidential election, and the numbers go up to, the 70% for older demographics. And I think there has to come a time where young people say, I'm not just going to focus on my community, which is really important, but that I'm going to have a voice on the national stage, and where the young generation takes their spot on the national stage. Business leaders, political leaders, they don't represent our country's demographics. They don't represent young people, which is ironic because if you think about it from just a time horizon, young people live with the impacts of what policymakers and business leaders are doing today for the longest amount of time. So if anything, we really need these voices in all of our leadership positions, and we need to at some point say, I'm not just going to leave that to other people and be apathetic about that. I'm going to actually go and have that voice and make those changes.
Right. Mike, is that does that sound like the people that you see in your research, or what's your reaction to what Neha just said?
Yeah, I think that it's a fairly enlightened view. I think that what Ronnie's saying is what we see in the research as well. I think that there's a lot of frustration. I don't think it's just amongst higher ed students or Gen Z. Like I said before, I turned 18 the very first year. 18-year-olds, I think, were allowed to vote, which I think was 1972, or at least it's a long time ago. At least that's the first time. So when you talk about, I hear the conversation about who you vote for and how does it matter. Your perspective over the number of years I've been voting, which I guess is 48 years. It's hard to believe because I look so much younger than that. But it does make a difference. But I think what the current generation's grown up with, they've grown up with a system at the national level where you have a president and you have a Congress that are kind of blocking each other, and it's creating this whole atmosphere of polarization, and that's not something that needs to continue to exist. And I don't have the answer as to how it gets broken. The obvious answer is that you have one party that takes control of the Senate, the House, and the White House, and then you have policy that you can execute. That's part of the issue, I think, that over the last, I guess it's almost 16 years, and Rodney and Neha probably weren't involved in politics much before then. You've got this atmosphere of gridlock, really, and arguing because one side knows it can leverage the other. And unfortunately, we have way too many professional politicians, people that have been in office for so long. And I'm not advocating one person over the other for sure, because there's some professional politicians that are very good, but there are a lot that just play the game. So, I think that's just an observation about how Gen Z and even millennials' perspectives have been shaped on kind of national. It gets back to local grassroots involvement, doing what both Rodney and Neha are doing, and Carolyn's doing it, in her organization, is really trying to impact at different levels where you live, where your feet hit the ground, you can make a difference. And I can't overemphasize that. It's good for a lot of things. It's good for your mental health. It's good for your feeling of community, and it's also good for the community at large. That's where it all starts. That's where change is going to have to start to break this logjam, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah.
And it has started. You guys have done a great job in your generation this summer, bringing it to the forefront.
Carolyn, how big a problem do you see that polarization being for the work that you guys are doing? Is a thing that comes up a lot, or is it not? I mean, Rock the Vote, obviously I guess 20, how many years now? 30.
30 this year.
I'm getting really old, since I can remember being in college when Rock the Vote was the thing. So that world that we live in, certainly at the national level that Mike was just talking about, is that a challenge for you, or is that not really the main issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no one challenge and there's no one solution, right? And I think so often we look for one problem and one solution, and it's not that. It's very, very complex. And actually, to this youth generation's credit, they understand that. I think the reality is our democracy hasn't worked for the people, no matter what generation, for a while. And there are structural changes that we can make to fix a lot of those things, right? Just even the fact that we have, I mean, young people, we don't tend to think of them, are a target of voter suppression efforts. This is the second presidential election without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Like, people don't think about that, right? And what does that actually mean? And it means that states and counties can change their laws days before an election. That's a problem, right? That there are things like, participatory budget processes. There are things like the Electoral College. There are conversations and changes that we have to make to actually look at our democracy and say, is it working the way that it was intended to actually work, right? And so what Michael was saying, it hasn't for a while. I do think, similar to what Rodney did, I think for police contracts and what policing looks like and what are the things that we can actually affect change on, we need to do more education about, yes, the system's frustrating right now. It doesn't help sitting out. We actually need to now force these changes in our democracy because we the people are losing power in it. I do think that there's so much focus on in disillusionment because we only focus on the federal government. We don't talk about state and local. And to be quite frank, they actually impact our day-to-day much more, but the voter turnout in a local election can be in the single digits or in the teens. So it doesn't take much to organize a community that then changes who the mayor is or who the city council is. But again, this comes back to, like, I actually love what Rodney said. I don't love, but he said it very well when he said, well, I don't know, maybe I just need to educate myself more. And I'm like, it shouldn't be on him. We are a democracy. By definition, we are supposed to have participation in our democracy, but we don't promote it. We're not doing anything. Like, civic education has completely fallen by the wayside in the last few decades. Like, right. That's a conversation we need to be happening, because that in itself is voter suppression. Right. We're not promoting or educating people about how the system works and how to participate in it in a very real and practical way. Sorry.
No, that's great. One of the things that jumps out in the research from Mike and the Barnes & Noble College Insight survey research is how much social media plays a role in all of this, and where people are getting the information, and also where they get their trusted information. And I know I think about, in my own professional life, the challenge of social media seemingly makes everything that we can target a bunch of stuff, but also it kind of makes everything really easily into a national conversation. Super quickly, everything is a national conversation. And instead of my neighborhood or my city, I live in a city of 17,000 people with a mayoral election next month as well. That's getting swamped in a whole different other conversation, right? So I don't know, for maybe Neha or Rodney, how do you guys think about the role of social media for your generation, but also for this question of civic participation? On the one hand, what Carolyn's talking about in education, but also the way it has some bad sides, and it can fuel that apathy and that feeling of no agency. Is there any thoughts on how we tackle that, or other than just throw our phones away? Rodney?
Yeah, I definitely see it as a gift and a curse, and I emphasize both. And it's a gift because, I could take my situation, for example. When I went to Louisville behind the Breonna Taylor case, I knew absolutely no one out there. I went with no one. I just knew which hotel I was going to be at. I didn't know what protest or what event I was going to be at. But thanks to social media and just through researching just a couple of hashtags, I got in contact with a city councilman and 3 community organizers, prominent community organizers in the Louisville area, who reached out back to me, told me where to meet them, told me what was going on. And when I went out there, they welcomed me with open arms. And so that's the gift of social media. Like, you can
super powerful.
Exactly. You can really, if you just look, you can find exactly, what you want and put yourself in a position that, that you want to be in. On the other hand, it's so easy to be misguided through, false information or false narratives and kind of get led down a rabbit hole, that could lead to a sense of apathy or could lead to a sense of insurmountable distrust of the government and, everyone around you. On the internet, it just looks like the world is burning. And you look outside and it's a beautiful day, and I think that's just where your attention goes and how you perceive your reality. And, I tell friends all the time, like, don't just perceive reality through a screen. Like it will throw you off. It really will throw you off. You have to go outside. You have to just go outside and look, and talk to people face to face. So yeah, I think it's a gift and a curse, in many ways.
Neha, how do you manage that for yourself?
I agree with a lot of what Rodney said. I agree with everything he said. I think, it goes both ways. It's a great equalizer. Everybody has a megaphone now. Everybody can connect with anyone else. I don't think it's even possible to overstate the impacts that has had on society. But yes, it means it's very easy to get stuck in a rabbit hole. It also means, I think Rodney and I are probably the first generation where every single thing we did is immortalized on social media forever. And that's something, that the world is going to have to change and respond to and deal with and process and incorporate in how we make decisions. So I guess I would say it's like any other tool, right? You can use it well, but you need to educate yourself and inform yourself and think deliberately about how you're going to use it.
Mike, what jumps out to you in your research when it comes to some of these questions around social media?
Questions around what? I couldn't hear the last
around
word.
Social media and its role in sort of civic life, and also just in its role. I know the research that you guys did looks at like where people get information and where they trust that information, and
what you see is an inverse relationship between the thirst for good and objective information and the trust level around it. So, specifically, it's like 80% of the students that we survey really want good, fair, unbiased information to educate themselves, but 70% don't think they're getting it from anywhere. So that's probably not a big shock to anybody, but how flipped around that is really, I don't know if it's a condemnation of our journalism, and but it's a mix of that and social media, and also the fact that politicians use social media to manipulate messages as well. It's human nature. It's a very complicated thing to try to solve, and as Carolyn says, there's no one or two or three correct answers, but the research shows is really no surprise. It's all the things that Neha, Rodney, and Carolyn have been saying, is that everybody wants the information, they're thirsty for it, they want to do the right things, but it's very frustrating because nobody feels like they're getting an unbiased source. So you have CNN, you have Fox News, you have all the networks, you have all the various other news networks that are springing up, claiming to be unbiased, but there's no trust involved. So the question is, what motivates you to participate when you don't trust?
Right.
And what motivates you to make a decision that when you don't trust the information? What I do personally is I look at all the different sources and I try to triangulate, but it's very difficult because you need a lot of time to do that.
Yeah.
So,
Carolyn,
the research supports everything that they're saying.
Yeah. Carolyn, does that question of trust come up a lot or not?
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot about trusted messengers,
Mm-hmm.
where are people getting their information from? And that's a big part of actually the role that Rock the Vote plays, that we, people should find their civic or political homes, whether it's Rock the Vote or other organizations, or find a few of them and kind of triangulate, as Michael's saying. But that's also why we work with trusted messengers like athletes or influencers, with brands, whether they're communicating out to their employees that we say, we care that you vote, you have a voice, we want to give you as much information that's vetted and relevant to you, in a nonpartisan way, because regardless of how people align with the values, they do want to get their information in a nonpartisan, straightforward way so they can make the decision. It's also why actually a huge part of what a big program we run is actually relational organizing, which is essentially just people communicating out to their friends and their family. We are the biggest, and this is incredibly important this year because so many nonprofits have not been able to get on the ground this year and communicate out. So much of the organizing has to be through friends and family and making sure, most people have that one or two people in their family that is a little bit more up on things. And you can share information that way, right? And it actually is a good community builder to be sharing that information. So that's a big part of actually a program we run right now.
That's great. The Rodney, Neha, what are the? This has been a great conversation. What do you think gets maybe oversimplified or misunderstood about either your generation or sort of the things that we're wrestling with right here? What do people misunderstand about you and your classmates sort of broadly? Maybe that's the mainstream media, maybe it's just your older uncle, I don't know, it could be a lot of people, but what do they miss, what do they get wrong? Rodney?
The first thing that I can think of, and this is almost like multicultural sentiments that I've seen from an older generation to a younger generation, is that we're soft and like we're sensitive and things like that. And I think to a degree that at least the sensitivity part can prove to be an asset, in a lot of ways, because again, that's what you use to gauge what you find intolerable and what you find tolerable. And I think that this year, our generation showed that we're not soft. And if there's a constant theme of injustice and it seems like tyranny, we're the first generation that went out again worldwide and burned buildings down to prove a point and to let people know, like, hey, we're not dealing with it. Not this generation, not right now. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud to be a part of this generation, and I really think that we have the ability to affect a complete 180 in terms of how things are run. Again, one of the things that I see that could possibly be a hindrance to that is social media and how things have become pretty polarized, how Michael was saying earlier, and just how we communicate, how communication through social media has become so short form instead of long form. And I think a lot of truth and a lot of solutions are long form because, as Carolyn said earlier, there is no one or two solutions. There's so many that have to be contextualized into handling an assortment of different issues. Albeit even police brutality. Like, you can't even address just police departments. You have to address the criminal justice system. You have to address DAs. You have to address judges. You have to address qualified immunity. So, it's like a 9-headed dragon, that you have to tackle. So short form and one-liner type solutions just aren't going to cut it. And if that's all we're reading with and agreeing with and applying that to solutions to massive problems like police brutality, I think it's going to be very hard to progress towards solutions in general.
Right. Neha, what do people misunderstand?
I'd add two things to what Rodney said. First is that we're not homogenous, right? For as many Biden supporters there are young people who also support Trump. For as many who live in cities, there are those that live in rural areas. We're not homogenous. There are a lot of us who are probably more similar to older generations. A lot of us are probably more similar to, now we're not even the youngest generation. So we're as varied as any other group. I think the second is that optimism is a strength and not a weakness. I think it's a common thing that, as you get older, people become a lot more cynical, and we think that that's becoming a lot more pragmatic, but I think that's actually losing a lot of the power and energy you need to change the world. One of my favorite quotes that my dad told me was that, being an optimist is not about whether the glass is half full or half empty. It's about feeling that you have the agency to fill up the glass and you have the power to fill up the glass.
That's great. Mike, we've got just a minute or two left. I'm wondering, back to the research that you've done and thinking more about this generation, and really eloquently described by Rodney and Neha, what has any of this and the research you've done changed the approach as a leader or at the company to sort of how you're working with, whether that's young people at the company or just in your life?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because that's what I was thinking about when they were both talking, is about, and I think they should feel good about it, the protests, the loudness of the protests, which is not that dissimilar to what happened in the late 60s and 70s when students were taking over universities, SDS, and all kinds of things were going on. I saw that at that time. But for example, in our company, we now celebrate, it might be simple, we now celebrate Juneteenth. We now have a full-time diversity and inclusivity function. And more importantly, we're getting our employees to open up because we have that. Listen, times are tough right now. We're cutting costs everywhere. We're not cutting them there where it makes a difference to our people, because you kind of suck the whole soul and fiber out of your company if you do that. So they should be heartened by the fact that many of the things that are being done and the nature of them that's getting the level of attention it is, has put a lot of pressure on what I would call corporate America to make changes that I think will be sustained and sustainable, and not just sound bites to get through this. And we're also, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing things within our own company to get them out to vote, educate them more. Our research, by the way, is all published on our website at bned.com if anybody wants to look at it, and on the student voice. But yeah, I think that optimism is a great thing, and I think you should be optimistic by the results that have occurred, because there is change happening that I think will be sustained, which is not something I would have said last year.
Well, we'll have to end there on that note of sustained